Unique people leading unique lives shape and inform Iowa City. This community is enhanced by these women and men who live in our midst, working, teaching, creating. Welcome to a series of conversations with people who have stories to tell. Join my guests and me, Ellen Buchanan, in a series of interviews called One of a Kind. My guest on One of a Kind is the well-known community politician, activist, and artist, Karen Kubby. Karen served on the Committee on Community Needs, the Free Medical Clinic Board, and is a founding member of Environmental Advocates. In 1989, she won a seat on the Iowa City Council and was re-elected in 1991 and 1995. In addition to her city council work, Karen, member of HACAP, the Hawkeye Area Community Action Program, and was vice chair of the Johnson County Council of Governments. For 5 years in a row, the readers of Icon, a local arts weekly newspaper, voted her the best politician and local activist. Among her many honors are the Isabel Turner Human Rights Award given by the Human Rights Commission. She was chosen the most powerful woman in town, and she had just turned 30. She was named one of the 10 key figures of the century by the Iowa City Gazette and awarded Woman of the Year by the Iowa Business and Professional Women. Some of her other involvements have been a coordinator for Upward Bound and a science learning assistant at New Dimensions of Learning. Karen Kubby is a graduate of the University of Iowa with a Bachelor's of General Studies, emphasis on science education, and holds an Iowa teaching certificate. Her art is an important part of her story. For the past 27 years, Karen has been self-employed as a potter and a beadworker. She currently serves as executive director of the Emma Goldman Clinic for Women. Welcome to One of a Kind.
Thank you.
I know your story starts in August of 1960 in Belvoir, Fort Belvoir in Virginia. You moved around a lot. You even lived in Iowa City. Mm-hmm. Tell the viewers a bit about your first family and their influence on you.
Well, I grew up in a military family. My dad graduated from West Point, was born and raised in Council Bluffs. My mother born and raised in Des Moines, so I am at core an Iowan. And not that many Iowans join the military through West Point. And both my parents are Jewish, and not many Jews are in the military as going through West Point, being a cadet. And so when we moved around all the time, we went everywhere. We didn't stay in one place very long, and so the educational system was my foundation. Like when I try to figure out where did I live, I think about I was in kindergarten, who was my teacher, then that tells me what town I was in. and that's part of Jewish culture too, a real secular value about education. And so that's how I track my life, is through my school years and remembering my different teachers.
And you were at Iowa City. Did you go to Helen Lemme?
I was one of those first kids in that experimental school that had the library at the center of it. And so everywhere you went in the school, you went through the library. And I think that that had a fundamental effect on how important I view library services as core community services, and my strong support as an adult, as a library user, as a policymaker, and as head of a referendum committee co-chairing with Mark Martin to get this new library here in Iowa City. So I think Helen Lemme's physical structure created a core value for me.
It's a great story. Librarians will love to hear that story. Now, there's a little story about Marvin Pomerantz and your father, and how that was one of the reasons maybe he got to West Point, because tell that story.
Yeah.
It's very...
Well, my dad and Marvin Pomerantz were on a double date, and Marvin was one of my few from my father's friends who had a car, and my grandmother got a call at home saying, the number one spot guy who had the number one spot for West Point from Iowa can't make it, Bob has got to get to the train station. He's got to be in New York by such and such date, by this time. You've got to go now. So my grandmother packed some things, knew where they were double dating, called the restaurant and said, you got to bring him home. Marvin, you got to get him to the train station. And Marvin got my dad to the train station on time so he could go to college and be at West Point.
Now, does Marvin, I wonder if he remembers that
He
story.
does, because when my dad turned 70, I was trying to think of what can I get him that no one else in the family can get him. And I thought of this story, so I called Marvin Pomerantz at home, thinking he'll never take my call, but it's worth a try. And actually his wife answered the phone. And I told her who I was and what I was looking for, and she said, your father took me to my senior prom. So I said, did you have a good time? She said, yes.
Good,
so I said,
good question.
So he wrote my dad this very personal birthday card, and my dad loved it. So I got him a really good gift.
That is great. Now, your grandmothers in Des Moines were very important, or have been an important part of your story, haven't they?
Yes, whenever Dad would go overseas, Mom would go back to Des Moines to be near family, brothers, and both grandmothers. And so I didn't spend a lot of time as a child with them, but they were very important when I did spend time with them. And then when we did live in Des Moines, I was with them a lot. So my mother's mother, Lucille Myers, was a staunch community volunteer. She volunteered all over the place, and she had very specific viewpoints about certain things, about political things. And she and I, even as a child, would have very intense political conversations. And she had very strong feelings about the death penalty and about Israel, and we would argue sometimes and agree sometimes, but it was loads of fun. She was also a mean gin player, so I learned how to play cards from that grandmother. And from that, you know, my mother was a volunteer. Even wherever we moved around, she was a Red Cross volunteer. And when I was actually looking for pictures for this, I found a picture from over 10 years ago of me getting my 10-year Red Cross pin, and it's been a few years since I volunteered, but I qualified for my 20-year Red Cross pin. And before being a volunteer, I took swimming lessons and was a water safety instructor, and so the Red Cross has been a big part of my volunteerism over the decades, as well as my mother. And my other grandmother, Miriam Kubby, my dad's mother, was a very independent woman. She was a single woman for a lot of her adult life after getting divorced from my grandfather, Ben Kubby, who I saw also and really loved him. He was an attorney and a magistrate, actually, in Des Moines. I remember as a kid seeing a yard sign, because it used to vote for magistrates, and it said, "Vote Kubby," and had my grandfather on it. I wish I had one of those yard signs. Oh my gosh.
You could have used that for quite a few elections.
And maybe in an antique store in Des Moines. I've never thought of that. I should, or maybe on eBay. Who knows what's on eBay? But Mims owned a movie theater. She was a realtor in the 30s, which was not very common for a woman to be selling property in the 30s. She was an independent seamstress, where she would make handbags or ties or dresses and take them to Yonkers and sell them to Yonkers. She, in her older years, in her later years, she would make ties, and she would see a local business person on television, an attorney, someone who owns a car dealership who had a fancy tie on, and she would just call them up and say, "You're going to love my ties, I'm coming Thursday at 10." And she would just show up, and then everybody would come, and she'd have her samples of material, and she would make ties for people.
So you did get your artistic
She was very talented.
enthusiasm and bent from your grandmother.
Yes, and she was a beadworker, and she used to put beadwork on wedding dresses and on cashmere sweaters. She would bead monograms, and so I started doing beadwork. There were beads at her house, so I was playing with beads, and we were lucky enough that on a weekend we would go to her house to build an outfit and learn some tailoring techniques from Grandma, the professional.
Now, you have two sisters.
I have two older sisters, and we all do embroidery and knitting and cross-stitch and needlework, and we're
a
all...
little industry.
Yes.
The
Now,
Kubby girls.
Grandma would make us have our skirts down to here, but we had skills, so we would just say, "Okay, that's great," and go home and make them whatever length we wanted.
Now, one of your two sisters still beads with you.
Yes, yes. My older sister, Laurel, and also a graduate of the University of Iowa, she was a math teacher and went back from the University of Iowa and then came back here for medical school. And she's an OB-GYN in Phoenix, although she's only practicing gynecology now. But she is a phenomenal artist. She is an architect in beads and makes gorgeous things. I have my middle sister, Cindy Johnson, has 2 children. She lives in Las Vegas, a graduate of the University of Iowa as a music teacher, and she's still teaching music in at the Las Vegas, Nevada school system. And she is an avid cross-stitcher. She does beautiful work.
My goodness, you girls, you have it just running in your blood, don't you?
We are busy bees.
You are busy bees. Never an idle finger or hand.
That is true and around us. When we get together, every Thanksgiving we get together as a family. And we rotate between Phoenix, Las Vegas, Seattle, where my parents live, and Iowa City. There's a long time Iowa City wasn't on the list because it was harder to get to, but finally we just demanded that Iowa City be on the list. And we get together and we laugh and we eat and we cook and we play with whatever dogs are around. And Cindy and Lori and I are busy doing our handwork. We have a little setup, we put our lights up, and that's just the craft area for the weekend for Thanksgiving.
I'm sure there are some viewers watching this who want to know about political discussions of the Kubby clan. Are you all politically aligned, or are you all over the place?
That's a good question. It used to be that when there was a lull in the conversation, someone would say, Cindy, ask Karen a political question so Dad and Karen can argue about it. But I have to say, my parents, I think, have gotten more liberal as they got older, and they're really liking to analyze things. So we always have very great discussions. I was hoping that my parents would move back to Iowa City because they still have friends who live here. They love the community. And my dad would be really good on the city council. So I was hoping he would come back here, run for city council. I could go door to door with him. We could have been the first father-daughter team on the council. We would fight like crazy about content, but agree on process. And it would be very interesting.
Well, it's not over yet.
That's right.
You know,
he's only in his early 80s.
There you go.
He's got lots of time.
I want to ask you, you were trained to be a teacher, but you didn't teach very long. Was that just not, you decided that wasn't your path, or did?
No, I would actually say that I'm always in a teaching, coaching, public education role in all the work that I do. But I knew that a mainstream public school and I would not get along. I probably wouldn't last very long. And so I was hoping that there'd be an opening at CEC, which is now Tate High School, for the science teacher. And I actually did a practicum under the previous science teacher who stayed a very long time because he loved his position. The kids loved him. Del Holland, who's also a very active member of Environmental Advocates. And I just ended up wanting to do my artwork full time.
So you did that.
So I did that. I made my living solely from that for over 20 years until I got the job at Emma in 1999.
And you told my research assistant, A.K. Traw, that you have a very low financial lifestyle.
Yes,
and
certainly.
That you could do it, though.
I could be a starving artist and survive well.
And survive well.
Well, I didn't have dependents, human dependents anyway. I had dogs and birds.
That's right.
And I lived in a housing collective, and so my living expenses were rather low, and I didn't buy a lot of things. I bought beads and clay and paid my rent.
Where did you throw your pots?
I did, and I continue to be at the Iowa City Rec Center. There's a really nice potter's studio there. I've been there since 1985, and I do a little bit of volunteer work there, not a lot, helping clean up and load kilns and unload kilns.
Where do you sell your ceramics?
Well, currently, only one place. I belong to a group of people called the East Side Artists, and we have a sale the first weekend of every December at the Masonic Building near the Iowa City Public Library. Great. And so we work as a group to produce the show, and we're also the artists that show and exhibit in the show.
And your beads are there too?
And my beads and pottery are both at that show, and that's the I can only produce enough for that show. And then I do special orders during the year.
Now I want to move to why did you decide to run for the city council at such a young age?
Well, I think my path was pretty common, actually. If you talk to most people who have run for office, they do so because they're upset about something. And I was upset about a few things, and it was mostly my perception that public spaces were being taken over by private entities. A park here, the Ped Mall, when the Holiday Inn came in and kind of disrupted that public space. I thought that I was a young campus activist who was reading the paper regularly and knew what was going on, and some trees were coming down and the Ped Mall was going to be intersected by a private entity that was for profit, and that didn't make sense to me. So I called the city clerk and said, how come there wasn't anything in the paper and what's going on? And someone there, I don't know who it was, said, if you really want to know what's going on, you should come down to informal council meetings every once in a while. Oh. And the timing of that woman saying that, and who knows, it may have been Marion Carr. She might be blessed or cursed by the community if it was her, but I don't know. And I started going, and it was very interesting to me. All these different issues, and for me it was kind of a negative role model of how to approach issues, because in the back of the room I'm mumbling to myself, no one's asking the following fundamental questions that need to be asked in order to make a decent policy decision. And I looked up there and there was no one who looked like me or lived like I did, but there were a lot of me's in town. And I was just as smart or smarter than a few people up there, and I thought, well, why not me? And so there were a few people who I approached, and they took me under their wing and helped me organize a few things, and I made a lot of mistakes. Wow. And I have to really thank my good friends David Lesh and Jeff Cox for not running away when this young campus activist wanted to get into local politics and made mistakes. They said, yeah, that was a mistake, and let's help you get back up and try again. And
how old were you when you started running?
Well, let's see. I started running in 1985, so I was 24. 24. And my age was a factor for people. And I kept thinking, well, maybe when I'm 30, people will take me seriously.
Was that, I was going to ask, what were the big, once you got elected, we'll talk about some of the highlights, but what was the most difficult thing for you? Was it your age? Was it your gender? Was it your politics?
I think it was a combination of those things, because I would actually get questions from reporters like, you're a young woman who's a socialist and not married. How do you expect to get elected? And at first I would get very defensive, like, none of those factors are really relevant. Let's talk about the issues. And then I realized that question is being asked each time I run and multiple times, so I said, well, that's who I am, and who I am believes in, and that's why I'm involved in volunteer capacity at the free lunch program, and I work on housing issues. And so then I got it back in my own way to my agenda, the content agenda of the community. You
were educating.
Yes.
You ended up having to educate some of the city council
and
people.
So instead of being defensive, how do I use that, what I interpreted as kind of a hostile question, as a springboard for what I want, the message I wanted to relay? And so I found that that skill was very helpful to me on the city council, because there were times when my colleagues were hostile to me. And that's me saying this out loud is no surprise to anybody. It was on television every night.
Sure, right.
And so my living with groups of people where we had to resolve conflicts on a constant basis taught me how to de-escalate, to validate, and to move forward.
Did you have thin skin that became tougher and tougher as the
years went by?
No,
I think I had pretty tough skin to begin with.
You didn't take it personally?
Not usually. There were times when I came home and I was glad that when I got there, there was popcorn and a beer for me.
Yeah, that's right. And your dogs to welcome you home.
That's right.
Oh.
But I think that I decided not to run again in 1999 because I was feeling a little dulled politically, being in the system for 11 years, and actually more like 17, because I was an appointed official before that. And I felt like I wasn't really doing my job with the edge that I wanted to do it with. And so I felt it's time for me to get out of the system, sharpen my edges, and maybe someday I can jump back in if I want to.
In those 11 years, what you look back, what was one of the highlights for you? What do you feel that you had your thumb on it and your thumbprint on some decision or
Well, I have to say something comes to mind very immediately. I can hear in my head Jim Glasgow, a developer, a very stubborn man who did a lot of building in Iowa City, yelling in the background, "I'll sign whatever you want, Kubby." And for me, that was a highlight. And it was about a grove of trees that are still standing on the corner of Scott and Court Street, where he was saying, I'm not going to cut the trees down. And I'm saying, well, then you'll sign a conditional rezoning agreement that says the trees will remain, and it makes it legal. So if that's your intent, there'll be no problem.
Sure.
Sign away. And he didn't want to sign it, and it kind of evolved, and he did end up signing it. The trees are still there. There's a family of owls that come back every year, and sometimes orphaned owls are brought to those owls to foster them. And the people who live there love these old bur oak trees. So that, like when my dad came to visit, he said, show me something you've accomplished. And it's like, well, I wish I could show you a municipal daycare center or something, but let me show you these trees.
And were the owls there?
And not the day that we came by. It was too early in the season. But from that came a discussion about a sensitive areas ordinance. And even though the ordinance, that if I were queen, I would have made it a little tougher. But it was...
You were queen.
It's fun to think about that every
That's
once in a while. But the process used was very good. There were environmentalists and political activists in the development community on an advisory committee that looked at the ordinance to say, how do we live out these environmental conservation values about wetlands and steep slopes and trees and groves of trees with the practicality of growth that's happening? How do we do it in a way that developers can actually live it out? And they came up with something, and it was supported by the majority on council. And now, just 10 years later, the county has a sensitive areas ordinance modeled on the cities.
So you're looking back, that's one of the things you're the most proud of.
I think that's an important piece.
I do too. And then also your support for the library.
Definitely.
You have to get that in.
Yes, it was a very long road to expand the downtown public library. And it was great frustration for me over many years of the council not being able to make a positive decision about it. And I'm very glad it was on the ballot. I was happy to put a lot of effort in along with many other people. And I have to say, I knew the ballot the referendum was going to win big. When we were all middle-aged, kind of not very active people who were, we were active in the community, but we weren't being energetic at the homecoming parade. And we had library yes signs. And we were just kind of walking with our signs. And all of a sudden, children started chanting, library, library. And it just rolled down. And all of us, we started dancing with our signs. And we knew we were going to win. Yeah. The children took over. It was incredible.
And that issue brought you into bed with a lot of different people who love the library.
Yes, it is the cornerstone of democracy, where everyone can have access to information and services and technology.
Free. We've got to keep the libraries
And I have to say,
free.
the new electronic service of reminding you when your books are due is really nice.
Oh, that's great.
So the library has been a very important community cornerstone from my point of view as to what basic city services should entail.
I want to talk to you about, now you have moved into another area, career. You're the executive director of the Emma Goldman Clinic, like I said in the introduction. And you had to debate about what I read about taking this job because for security and safety reasons. How was that resolved?
Well, I knew that I didn't want another term on the city council in 1999, and I thought, well, maybe I'd like to live off more than $8,000 or $10,000 a year in this town while you're trying to pay a mortgage.
Right.
And so maybe I want to look for some work part-time, and hadn't updated my resume, my work resume, since 1985, so I thought, well, it's time to do that.
Mm-hmm.
And I just heard through the grapevine about this opening at Emma and thought, well, there's no way I'm going to get the job, but it'll get people knowing that I'm interested, and it'll get my skills for interviewing back up if I'm lucky enough to even get an interview. And then when I was offered the job, which I was surprised and very pleased at, I had to really consider, as a public figure, what that meant for my life, because typically when extreme anti-choice activists are targeting a clinic, they target the physical building, they target the medical director, and they target the administrative director, which I would be. And I had to really think about, do I want to incorporate a higher level of security on a daily and momentary basis in my life? And I went back and talked to my family about it, and I made the decision that this is really the perfect job for me. And so I took it, and so I wanted to get my edge back. Well, becoming part of abortion provision was one way to do that.
And so what are your responsibilities and what services for some people who might be new to town? What are the Emma Goldman services that are provided?
Yes, and sometimes we're known only as an abortion provider.
And you do much more.
Yeah, and certainly we're proud to provide abortions from 3 weeks to 20 weeks, and so and 5 days a week. So we really are a place where people come from all over Iowa and surrounding states to get high quality services, because they have to travel and because of reputation. But we also provide, most of what we do is gynecology. So basic gynecology, lots of annual exams, birth control consultation, menopause consultation. We see men in our gynecology clinic for testicular exams and self-exam instruction, HIV testing, lots of sexually transmitted infection testing and treatment.
Is there financial help for people who can't afford to use your services?
We have a sliding scale fee for all of our services. We also offer a free walk-in clinic 6 days a week where people can come and get free pregnancy tests, free blood pressure checks, and non-biased options counseling.
I haven't seen any demonstrators for a while.
We get between 30 and 50 picketers a month.
Oh, you do?
So we do. We have a group that comes every Friday to say some prayers and do the rosary. And most of our picketers are very respectful. They are not blocking the way. They are not screaming obscenities or screaming at our client. They're not violent. They're very respectful. And I will fight for their rights to be there and respect them as part of our community. We have had a few people, though, who have been very intimidating and threatening, and we have no contact orders and injunctions against those folks. So we have one person who can't be within 100 feet of me or my home.
Okay.
And they can't be on the same side of the street as the clinic.
And how many years have you been with Emma?
Just about 8.
8 years.
Yeah, it seems pretty amazing to me. Time is flying.
I always ask my guests who or what has had a major impact or influence on their life. Who has influenced you?
I feel like I'm pretty lucky. I have a lot of people who have influenced me. My family, first and foremost, from my grandmothers to my mom and dad and my 2 sisters have been, I'm the baby, so I have the advantage of having relaxed parents and 2 older sisters to decide which parts of them do I want to have as role models or not. And so my family is definitely very important to me, and I think as an Army brat moving around, that's your constancy, is your immediate family that you're with all the time. But also the mayor of Milwaukee, Frank Zeidler, was a great influence on me. He was mayor of Milwaukee from 1948 to 1960, and he was a socialist mayor.
Now, how do you know about him?
Well, I was a member of the Socialist Party for a really long time. I'm not currently a member. I was a member from 1980 until 2005, so a long time. And I joined as a 19-year-old. And he was with a group of socialists who were what are called sewer socialists. So they are practical socialists, where they have this ideal about a democratic society where people's basic needs are taken care of as a floor, And then personal initiative and skills get you to a higher floor if you want to be in the penthouse. And they were practical socialists who wanted to make sure that the sewer system was environmental and run well, that the water was high quality, that there were public spaces, that the schools were in good shape, and that the lights were on and the buses ran on time, and that there were lots of options for public transportation. And it's like, that's who I am. I'm a sewer socialist. I am such a sewer socialist. And so I went to national meetings and always found Frank and talked with Frank, and he just passed away last summer. He stayed in his house until the very end, and was a beloved speaker in Milwaukee and throughout the Midwest until the very end.
Did he write a book about his experiences?
There is a book about his life.
Is there?
Yes.
And
Yes.
do you remember the name of it?
I don't off the
That's
top of my
okay.
head. I have a copy of it at home.
And his name is
Frank Zeidler.
Frank Zeidler.
Yeah, he's a wonderful person and really believed in human rights. And I think the other thing on City Council, some of the work that was done when I was there, I was very proud that there was a 7-0 vote in 1997 to include gender identity as a protected class in Iowa City's Human Rights Ordinance. And now just this summer, well, I guess it's quite not technically summer, this spring, Governor Culver signed protections for sexual orientation and gender identity into Iowa law.
Well, Iowa City and the City Council was leading the state in that.
That's right.
Question: What do you like best about living in this community, Iowa City, Johnson County?
What I'm about to say, I knew when I was in 6th grade. I used to steal quarters from my dad's dresser to get on the bus and to hang out downtown, because in 1969 and 1970 it was quite a vibrant, wild, active place, downtown Iowa City. It's still a very fun place to come, so I encourage people to come downtown, because you can shop, you can dance, you can eat, you can drink.
Watch movies.
That's right.
Yeah.
There's all kinds of things happening downtown. And as a 6th grader, as a fifth grader, I was here in 5th grade in 69, I knew that when I figured out whoever it is I'm going to be, that I can come back here and be that person. And I knew that then. I couldn't articulate that, but I knew it. I knew it. So I came back here as soon as I graduated from high school, and was I came with a suitcase and a box, and no winter coat, and I've been here since '78 and very happy to still be here. Actually, I had someone that was in a class that I was a teaching assistant for in the science ed in the graduate program at science ed, was contemplating moving back here, and he'd kind of followed my career over time and he was concerned about some negative changes in Iowa City and wanted to know my perspective. And I said, well, it's really mixed. There's some things that I wish were different, but there are some really beautiful things that have grown in Iowa City. And I just love this place. I'm a huge Iowa City booster. When I would go around the Midwest doing art fairs, I had a big cross-stitch sign from my sister Cindy, who would say, Pottery and Beadwork by Karen Kubby, Iowa City, Iowa. Everyone always had an Iowa City story to tell me, some connection to Iowa City.
Well, I'm so glad you're here, and I hope you're here for a very long time,
Well, thank
Karen.
you.
And thank you for being my guest on One of a
Thanks for
Kind.
having me.
My guest on One of a Kind has been the community leader, politician, activist, and artist, Karen Kubby. Words used to describe her are intelligent, committed, fair-minded, hardworking, passionate in her beliefs, and a very nice person. She has left her mark on our community. Karen Kubby is one of a kind.